Hey everyone, this is the distribution team demo for April 14th, 2022. And today I'm talking about pipelines page that we've added to our monitoring application that we use in distribution. And before I get into the application, I kind of want to highlight the problem. Um, Usually when you're creating a dashboard or a dashboard page, you're trying to get answers to questions that are hard to answer with the current system. And so in this scope, we're trying to figure out the relative priority, um, get a sense of, distribution has several projects and we want to see how healthy the build pipelines for each project are in relation to each other. The thought is that this will help us better prioritize, the maintenance that we do on pipelines for our different projects. So on my screen, you can see I'm sharing the issue for this in the browser. And we've got an MR open. This is in the final stages of review, so it is still on a branch, but should be merged here shortly. So back to that problem, if you're looking at our different projects and trying to get a sense of like the relative durations or the relative success failure rate of our projects, up until now, what we do is you go into the analytics / CI/CD part of each project in GitLab, and it shows you these nice graphs. The problem here is that this is kind of like a prepared statement that's being returned from GraphQL. And so you see these pipeline durations for the last 30 commits. I looked in the GraphQL quite a bit as part of implementing this page, and you can't change that 30 commits. That's just part of, there's an API route called like pipeline statistics for project, and it passes back exactly what we're seeing on the screen. So if you wanted to say something like, what were the durations for the last 3 months, then this isn't going to do it for you. You're going to have to either use the GraphQL or the HTTP API yourself and dig that out. So this is from the monitoring project, but of course, this tab is for the omnibus project. I talked about durations a little bit, how we're stuck to the last 30. In the upper left here, you see we have these overall statistics, which is like for the entire since the project was created, the pipelines. I'm not sure how useful this is, like overall, like I guess I don't know what questions you would answer by knowing that, since its creation, Omnibus passed its pipeline 75% of the time. It's usually more like temporal, right? I want to know for the past 2 months, 3 months, 1 year versus the year before, like sort of analytics like that. And then on the bottom, we have the pipeline charts, and similar thing here. We give last week, last month, and last year, but this is also part of that prepared statement. So if you want to say last 3 months, then you're not going to get it from this page or the query that generates this page. So what do we do about this? We've already got a monitoring application that we use on distribution for the monitoring the merge requests that are ready for review. We're all familiar with this page. And so it's nice that we already have an app. Adding a page to an app is a lot easier than standing up an entire app and then adding the first page. So since we have 2 pages now, part of this story, I added some navigation. You can see now we have this back to slash, which takes you back to home. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to navigate around. But this is the new pipelines page that I'm talking about. And so I'm going to cover the web element a little bit, and then I'll dive more into the code and the GraphQL so we can talk about how this happens. But you see immediately that we have all of our projects listed alphabetically, and it's showing the success rate of the default branches, which for us right now is either main or master, whichever we're using for each project. It pulls from that because we don't care what the success rate is on, feature branches and stuff. They break as a series of working on them, and that's a normal thing. So it's not too compelling to track for branches. So you see here, like this might be, we see the reference architecture tester is at 48% on its main branch or its default branch. So, this might be, I don't know for sure, but this might be an indication that we need to put a little more priority towards the main pipeline on for that project. Something else might have happened. Of course, you have to apply some context here, but at least we can see them all in one place now. So that's the middle column here, the success rate, and then we've got the duration in the right column, which we're doing min, median, and max of the duration of the pipelines. We're using median instead of average because outliers will skew an average and they won't skew a median. So there's a little filtering that goes on here too. I noticed working with the API sometimes you'll get back a duration of 0 for a pipeline, which I suppose there's any number of cases that could happen. Maybe you pushed it and the pipeline configuration YAML was incorrect. I think that results in a 0 duration pipeline. There's a few different cases for that, but for this application, we filter those out because they're not so useful. You can see in the projects on the left-hand side that this is not all of the projects the distribution is responsible for. We're filtering out projects where there are no pipelines for the duration that we're talking about. So there are more projects than this, but unless they have pipelines, they're not going to show up here. And that just unclutters the interface a bit. You don't have rows where things are zeros. That's just kind of noise. Okay. It's kind of it for the page. Did anybody have questions before I move into the implementation? All right. So like I said, we are using GraphQL. I'm looking at the branch for this right now. We're using GraphQL for a couple reasons. One is that, and you can see here in the lib, now we have a GraphQL query. It's an ERB template. Let me make it a little bigger. That we render it via ERB so we can inject these projects and stuff. But when I first started looking at this, the obvious thing to do is to use the REST API because we already have a GitLab Ruby gem API Ruby gem. But starting to look into it, into the API routes. So we want two bits of information here, right? We want for pipelines, we want to know the duration and we want to know the status of the pipeline. And the REST API, if you call the route, if you say for project 125, I want all of the pipelines. Well, the objects that are returned in that pipelines list query do not include the duration. So you have to make a subsequent REST API call for every pipeline to grab the duration out of the object. And this app is 1 month right now, but is a 1 month window right now, but this is just the start. Like we've already been talking about how we want to do like comparisons between, maybe this past 3 months and the 3 months before that, if you want to do quarterly or month by month. So we're talking about, potentially tens of thousands of pipelines. And that's a lot of REST API calls, which is slow, which slows down the build of the static site we're using here. So looking into GraphQL a little bit, there are some interesting things about it too, but I think it ends up being a better framework for making these sorts of more complicated queries that might return a lot of objects. And so you can see here, I'm sharing on the left, this is the query that we're passing into GraphQL. And so you see here on line 14, we've got the query, you can give it a name. Then we're iterating through the projects that are passed to that are rendered to the query. And then we're pulling out a few fields, so like ID, name, web URL, and then this main and master. So you can, this is basically just saying only give me the pipelines that are on these branches. There's not a way, unfortunately, ref doesn't take an array. That would be nice if you could just pass an array to ref and not have to like create two different nodes with different edges. GraphQL is an edge or is a graph-based database. So when you get results back, you've got nodes and edges that you might have to like clear out and trim up before you pass it into further data structures. One nice thing though it does have is this idea of fragments. So this is pretty much like a reference in YAML. You can define it once and then use it throughout the project, and that's what we're using here. So this fragment is saying, these are the things I want to know about the pipelines that I'm retrieving. And then down when you're specifying the branches, you can just use that reference instead of, writing that code again. So yeah, this is the GraphQL query. Let me go back. We've got a new pipelines model. So in this lib folder, lib data sources folder, we already had merge requests, which is using the GitLab client that I talked about previously to find those MRs. The pipelines it's very similar, like it uses all the same. This is Manic, right? You have to have an up method that updates your data source and an item method that returns slices it based into paths so you can retrieve them later. And so we're not using the GitLab API here, but it's pretty easy to just hit the GraphQL endpoint here. With GraphQL, you post the query as data, but it's not like, from HTTP, you would think a post would affect the state, it would modify the state of the system, but that's not how it works in GraphQL. A post is just a query. So yeah, we render that template, send it back, and then kind of build up our own data model with the relevant bits. One interesting sort of challenge here is that so for, we're making queries that are not just going to return 50 items. They might return hundreds or thousands of items. So we're talking about pagination now, right? Like same as a REST API. But the way that GraphQL implements this is with these cursors. And a cursor is basically, it's like a base 64 encoded string that refers to a position in a list of GraphQL resources, but that it's not like filtering in a REST API where you're giving it, because what we're doing here is we're saying that, let me switch back to the query. We're saying that we only want pipelines updated after X or after the cursor. And so that's how we're getting things from the past 2 months and not getting everything in the world. And so the way that this happens, I had to, in the GraphQL here, you can see we're looping through the project IDs that get passed to the query, but and that would be nice if we were able to just say, hey, give me all the pipelines for all the projects. That's one query for GraphQL versus, how many hundreds or thousands for REST. But it gets a little tricky when you're working with queries because of those cursors. And so if you're pulling back multiple projects with multiple sets of pipelines, and you have to keep track of multiple cursors in relation to each other in order to make a following GraphQL query. So that all just kind of got a little too complicated for me. And so basically what we're doing is that for every project, we are making a GraphQL query. So for this page, we're making like 10 queries to the database, which I feel like is acceptable. And that's just so we can have an easier time, like with this pagination with the has next page of the cursor, so we can grab all of the data. Yeah, that's most of the source code for that. This pipelines is also using this projects.yaml, which is the list of the project IDs we're responsible for. So we had talked about this when we were doing merge requests, but it's nice to just have a list of static data that any of these pages can use to grab the project IDs. Yeah, so I think, this is the current state of things. I think this is a good MVP, but uh, it helps us answer questions like how are projects doing, success fail and relative to each other. What's a heads up overview of the duration and the range that we're seeing in pipeline times. But there's some obvious jumping off points here. It'd be nice to be able to go back further in time, or maybe go back in ranges of time. So you can say, instead of just for the past month, I want to do the past 3 months, or maybe some event happens at GitLab or something, or something, an event in our team. Like, I don't know. We all take 2 weeks off, we hire somebody new, whatever. It might be nice to, view this data for a range in time. So you could say, like, from last November to this February, what were the statistics? And then along with that, since we're talking about range of time, being able to see, and this is what the CD analytics page shows. Like, it shows the durations for the pipelines for the last 30 minutes, and then it's showing some historical trend data here for the success fail. But I think that some version of that, being able to say, well, our pipelines are getting slower over time, faster over time, this kind of data all heads up in one place will help us, I think, put some priority on what projects we focus on, because we can't just give 100% to every project all the time. Okay.
Dustin,
Yeah.
just to give you an idea, something that I have done in my case when I was working with some of the time sensitive data, like for example, each week I'm generating what I worked on by going to the APIs, and I'm just creating the static page just like you do here too. But what I also did is the pipeline that runs it, it has the default values that just generates for the last week, the report for the last week. But on the flip side, you can actually run it with the custom values and produce whichever section you want. You can produce for a year, for 2 months, whatever. So perhaps there'll be just, maybe it's not ideal and it's not immediately available, but at least one can run the pipeline and take a look at the results for themselves as an alternative to this, because we don't have any database behind it to actually store the time series to create a nice graph. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good point. I had kind of thought about that, because yeah, every time we refresh this page, it's pulling it fresh from the API. And there is some caching with Danak, but it's kind of like a file level caching. Like, it's just sticky stuff in a build directory. So that's not really distributed or whatever. So yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I think it would be nice to have a data source that we could query more, but that's kind of what GraphQL is, right? We're making queries into the giant data source that is the GitLab API.
One other thing I would kind of see us being able to do right out of the box, again, because it's a static content, that what we could do, we could pull, like we could publish the data as a JSON or YAML, whatever that is, as an artifact for each job, and just query the last successful job, pull the data, and then you can display the delta here, and we can key that by the execution. If we combine the two suggestions that I've made, so the custom execution will not publish the stuff into the artifact, but the scheduled stuff will. And then you can see the delta. It went up, it went down, that kind of a thing. I don't know.
Yeah,
Just
right. Yeah, I like that. I mean, it makes a lot of sense because this is data that is not being updated, right? Like these are past pipelines. This data is never going to be updated. So querying for it, the same data every time is kind of wasteful in a lot of ways. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to, getting this merged in. This is the first pass, and I'm sure just like with the merge request application, we'll make this better as a team and more usable for us.
Kind of curious with the GraphQL API, how long does it take to generate this report in comparison to the MR report?
This takes well, it's kind of hard to tell because it compiles them together, but I did notice it was taking locally like 5 seconds to compile the MR, and then once I added pipeline in, it's now 15 seconds.
oh,
But I
that's
did,
terrible.
yeah, I mean, I did notice that when I bumped it up to 2 months, there's basically a linear relationship between the size of the GraphQL query, so it took twice as long.
And just in general, how was it working with GraphQL? Was it pretty easy to iterate on, and was there good documentation? Just because I see there's probably opportunities elsewhere that we could use those endpoints instead of basic REST API endpoints,
Yeah, the GitLab documentation for GraphQL is pretty much all I referenced. I'm trying to get uh, so the documentation is good. The API is fully documented. I'm getting to the GraphQL Explorer page somewhere in here. Yeah. So this Explorer was really helpful. It's yeah, GitLab GraphQL Explorer, because this is just a console for GraphQL. And so when I was building this query here, this query and even the fragments and everything, you can put all of that into the Explorer. And so that made it nice because you could just change things. And then one thing about the Explorer too is that it auto-completes. And so if you're saying pipelines semi or parentheses and you start typing something, it'll auto-complete all the fields for you. So you don't have to like guess about it. And then when you click into if you click on a field name, it pops up the docs, which are the same as from the GitLab GraphQL docs. So I'd say I didn't use a whole lot of like outside GraphQL blogs or documentation or stuff other than to understand the cursor stuff a little bit. But the GitLab GraphQL docs explains that briefly. But yeah, I'd say it was a positive experience. I didn't have to read like a ton of documentation. It was obvious where I needed to go in the docs to, it's just alphabetical, the API docs for GraphQL. So you can jump down the pipelines and find it pretty easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that I did find with the GraphQL when I was kind of trying it out for other purposes, and that was not all of the endpoints are exposed in GraphQL. So
Yeah.
certain things you cannot query on, period. And that was like where I stopped because the stuff that I wanted was not there. So I ended up doing that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I would say is that, while working on this, one of the things we needed to do was to have this, was it updated after? One of these, I think it was updated after was not, or maybe it was, I forget. One of these fields was not there when I started this MR. And so Mitch had already created an issue for GraphQL to investigate it. And then Charlie Ablett hopped on and helped us and actually added this field. So I'd say if the GraphQL API doesn't have something we want, like it seems like it's pretty easy to get some help to, add fields or routes or whatever.
Yeah, that was awesome. Two quick more questions then. So in that Explorer, it will actually run the query and return data for you in the UI?
Yeah. let me actually, I'll just paste in a pipeline ID. Get rid of this. It's also got all the shortcuts of like VS Code, like I just did Control D there to select multiple things. So it's kind of like an IDE. But yeah, let me
Awesome.
grab just the ID here quick. So grab the ID for GitLab operator, put it in here. Yep, here we go.
And then if you need to if you need to get any like private projects, you just pass an authorization header in the
Well, I
HTTP.
think I'm already authorized. I'm already authorized by being logged in to this because I
Logged
was
into the.
testing this with security mirrors too, and it worked.
Yeah, it
Got
uses
it.
your GitLab login.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah.
And
So
oh, sorry. In that in the UI, you were showing where it kind of had presets for like prepared statements for data.
yep.
Is the GitLab code base basically doing the same thing, like posting an HTTP post request to get that data, or is there some kind of library that makes it easier to interface with GraphQL and not have to do that data translation step?
I think they've pretty much they're it's in the prepared statement, all that logic. Like let me just find it here quick. It's pretty easy to find. Project statistics. Yeah, so there's this project statistics item in the, or it's pipeline statistics. I don't know, it's somewhere in here, but basically there's not a whole lot of stuff going on the front end here, like at the JavaScript level or anything. Basically they created a special route for this page that just passes back the data already prepared.
Got it. So there's nothing, there's no like handy library to handle that data, pagination and wrapping into objects, etc. Just something we'll
No,
have to do.
yeah, we did it from scratch for this so far. It would be nice to have we're doing the pagination here with a while loop, and that we're building up this project item. But yeah, it would be nice to have some of the syntactic sugar that's in the REST API gem where it does this. Because one of the other things that I ran into, I guess, with GraphQL objects is that you have like edges and nodes objects that wrap other objects. And there is a JavaScript library. I think it's called like GraphQL Prettify or something, but it strips out all of those extraneous objects and like vertices and all that. That doesn't exist for Ruby yet, but that would also be another nice improvement because that's one reason we're creating a data structure from scratch um, instead of just parsing the data that comes back, and returning that. I think that's what you do more for HTTP or like a JSON API is you know you don't have to translate the data too much before you pass it to the view. But I don't know if there are plans to bring GraphQL into the GitLab API gem or whether that's another gem. I don't know like what the community standards are if you do two or just do one.
Yeah, it makes sense. Because in your opinion, it probably wouldn't make sense to use GraphQL for the MR dashboard, right? Because there's so much less data and it's a simpler query. Is that fair?
Uh, I mean, it might be a little more work on the Ruby side to do it, but I guess it seems kind of like case by case basis, right? Because if it might be the case that to pull all the data you have for the MR dashboard, you might be able to do that with one GraphQL query and then paginate through it like we're doing here. It might be the case though that like Dimitri said, there's a route that's missing or something, so that turns it into a little more work. But yeah, I think it's gonna have to be case by case right now.
Got it. Yeah, it just seems like in the future, it seems like it'd be nice to try with GraphQL first to see if you can get it all in one neat query. And if not, then you could fall back on REST.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is kind of nice to having the query, you know, even if it is a template in the project, like checked in versus like, you know, in the Ruby code. I don't know, just for me, it's nice to have this as an example to look back at. Like when I forget how we did fragments in 2 months, I can just look at the query instead of like having to read through the code. So
Yeah. Yeah, the syntax is really unique, but it's pretty readable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's one problem I found with the GraphQL is that if you're not in it all the time, it kind of flies out of your head. It's not sticking there really well.
yeah, yeah, I could see that. But I mean, I've got, you know, a lot of REST API experience, a little GraphQL experience. So I don't know. It's the new kid on the block for me.
Cool. Yeah, it was awesome.
Thanks, Dustin.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you. All right. Yeah, I think that's it for this time. So we'll get this recorded and published, and we'll make this app better as we go. Thanks, everybody.